Hi there, everyone, and welcome to this very special, very first episode of The Shift Live. Today, we are doing an Ask Me Anything on frontline stress and well-being. And while we get started and while we wait for the last few people to join, I'm going to go through and do a little few bits of intro. And first of all, starting by introducing who we are. So today, you are joined by Blink. And we'll talk a little bit more about who we are and what we do very shortly. But this is what is going to be happening today over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. After our very short and sweet intro, our panel is going to be taking questions that have been submitted by all of you guys ahead of today's event. We'll be running through those for about 30 minutes or so. And then we are going to be taking questions from you guys. So what we're going to be asking you to do is submit your questions over the course of the discussion today, anytime you want. I'll show you how to do that in just a second. And then we will move to a close and we'll all be wrapped up in about 45 minutes. So very briefly, a few bits of housekeeping for everyone. The questions button, the all-important one, is just down at the bottom of your screen there. So if you open that up, you can just pop in your question there and it will go through to our panel. Like I said, submit them throughout the course of the event. We will answer as many as possible in the time that we have. You also have a chat box there as well. So if you have any issues with things like audio or video throughout the course of today's event, then do let us know there, and then we can make sure that we do our best to fix it. In the meantime, if you also just want to introduce yourselves on the chat and say where you're calling in from, we would love that. At absolutely no obligation. You can also do emoji reactions as well, should you wish to. All of today's discussion is going to be recorded as well. So everyone will receive a recording of this in their inboxes tomorrow. And so you can share that and do whatever else you like with it. Okay, so that is all of the key housekeeping for today. Very briefly, coming back to who we are at Blink, we are the world's best frontline app. So we work with over 250 organizations, working with people like Ian, who you're about to hear from, to create frontline experiences that drive loyalty, drive efficiency, and drive retention. So some of our stats there that I won't bore you with, but hopefully we'll be seeing much more of you guys in the future. So all of that intro stuff out of the way, I would like to bring to the stage our moderator for today, Simon White, our very own VP of People. Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Hannah. Great to see you all today, and thanks for joining the webinar. As Hannah said, my name is Simon White. I am the VP of People at Blink, and I've been here for just over a year. So I have the dual honor of working on a platform which does a lot for employees and helps employees have a better workplace experience, and also being responsible for driving that workplace experience for the employees, designing, building, and selling that platform as well. I'm very grateful today to be joined by two experts in the space that we're going to talk about. Firstly, we have Chris Stewart with us. Chris is the MD of Minding Minds, which is a mental health first aid training company. Chris has been in mental health and substance misuse for over 15 years, and he regularly commentates on both BBC News and radio on these specialist subjects. So really looking forward to getting Chris's input on this. And my other guest today is Ian Gordon. Ian worked in the US healthcare space for close to 30 years and held executive roles in many large provider organizations, most recently as the President of Administrative Operations at Elara Caring. Most importantly for today's discussion, Ian has led large frontline organizations and creates environments where employees can thrive and customers are satisfied. And that's ultimately what we're going to be talking about today and trying to learn a bit more of together as a group. So grateful to have you both with me today, gentlemen. And what we're going to do is we're going to move into some questions that we're going to work through together. I know all three of us have got a lot we want to say, so we'll try and not talk over each other, but try and get to as many questions as possible. So our first question for today is, what do we mean when we talk about stress and well-being in the workplace? I think this is a really important question to start with, because these are words that are very, very important, and we need to be really intentional about how we use. To be really clear, when we're talking about stress and well-being in today's context of this discussion, we're going to be really focusing on how do your employees experience those feelings in the workplace? How does your employee have a response to what they feel as workplace stress, or experience something that causes them to not feel like their well-being is being prioritized at work? Words like stress also have a medical connotation, and we want to be really, really clear that there's obviously medical groups and medical support available. We're going to really focus on that human reaction today. And then on the word well-being, this is another word that's really important. There are many factors that contribute to employees' well-being in the workplace. And particularly here in the UK at the minute, this is a really prevalent topic. We're hearing a lot on our news channels about how our employees don't feel their well-being is good in industries that are currently taking industrial action, or in industries that are currently in negotiation with our government. Those are topics that we could spend an entire webinar on, and maybe someday we will, and that would be super exciting to talk about. But what we're going to really focus in on today is focusing in on how we as leaders and we as managers can promote individual well-being, how we can help people be happier at work and really give them what they need to be productive, well, and feel like their employer really cares about them. So, Chris, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. What do you think employees need to feel well at work?
Thanks. Great to be here. It's a topic that, if we go back to 1974, when the Health and Safety at Work Act came in, and people turned around and said, "You've got to get rid of asbestos. You've got to change guards. You've got to change guards on machines. You've got to tell people how to pick boxes up." The companies turned around and said, "We can't do this. This is too difficult." But yet that change eventually happened. And I frame it with that at the beginning, because I think we're at that point now where companies have got to realize that the changes that have got to happen in the workplace culturally, so from the top down, those have got to be in place. And we worked with Yo Sushi, and when we went in and started their mental health first aid training, we kind of hit it from the top down, from board level, and they took it on board. And it wasn't just our training, but everything within the company changed. And within 18 months, the salaried staff churn had dropped by kind of 9% in there, and people felt like they were heard. And I guess above everything else, I think what employees need is a freedom to be heard and say what they feel. And part of the regulations within that Health and Safety at Work Act say that employees should have the ability to feed back with freedom as to what's going on for them. When people aren't heard, when people are feeling, stress is a kind of combination of high demand, low control, and no support. When that's happening, these people are just going to get sicker, and that's when we kind of get into presenteeism, but I'll talk about that later. But really, I just framing it's a lot that needs to happen culturally within the business, but as a frontline manager level, having honest conversations with your people and giving them the ability to be honest back with you, I think is fundamental. I think I'll just leave that there.
Fantastic, Chris. Thank you for that. Absolutely agree. That open dialogue, open communication is going to be absolutely critical. Because just because your employees or your team are not talking about these topics doesn't mean they're not top of mind. It more likely means they don't feel they have a space they can talk about it. And Ian, over to you. What about this idea of like happiness at work? What do you think are the things that really make up happiness at work?
So I think the drivers of happiness apply to both frontline workers and folks who are actually at desks or in offices. But I think it's more acute in the frontline worker environment that you focus on this. And two principal things that I always think about are a level of independence. To be able to operate in an autonomous manner, especially when you're a frontline worker out in the field and often feel that you're out there by yourself. You want to operate independently, but you need the support from the organization. So I think that's absolutely critical. On the other end of that is really community connectedness, especially in the front line. It's much easier to do in a work environment, an office environment. But when you're in a frontline environment, how can you get connected to your peers, to your boss, to your boss's boss in the organization? With that, I think come a few words that I think are really, really important, and that's happiness will come when you've created an environment where employees feel that they're trusted, respected, and appreciated, and helping them understand that they are doing valuable work, and that they are making an impact, and they can measure that. When you put all that together, folks feel good about where they are, what they're doing, and have the support. And that's really, really important, that they feel the support from their peers, from their direct supervisor, as well as the rest of the organization.
Absolutely. You said something really interesting, Ian, that I'd love to pick up on. You used words like support and community, which are words that I think historically we've probably seen as softer skills, or skills more linked to the qualitative of work. But then you used the word impact, right, which is a very quantitative word, and a word we love in 2023 to talk about how people do at work. How do you think that idea of giving people support and community translates into impact?
Well, when you think about what the folks do, or anybody does to do their job, the lack of the support really puts it in a place where they often flail, or just give up, or try to do things and don't have the ability to do them successfully and get frustrated. And so, ultimately, when you see the impact, you see it through your customers. And if you're in the healthcare space, some of the things that you see right away will be less satisfied customers, or patients. If you're serving folks, and the people who are engaging with them, with your customers, with your patients, depending upon whatever industry you're in, you'll see them leave. You'll see your marketplace reputation degrade, because people, as we all know, you tell one person when you're satisfied and you tell 10 people when you're not. So I think you'll see that happening. You'll see productivity improve for folks when they feel supported, because they have the tools and they can get to things efficiently and effectively.
Yeah, fantastic. I completely agree. And although it's not the specific question we're answering, why do we talk about this? This is not just an internal problem, right? What Ian, you've identified is some very tangible commercial concerns and issues that are caused by not talking about this and investing in it. So super important subject for us all to be talking about, both from an internal facing view, but also with that commercial lens on it as well. Cool. We're going to move on to our second. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
I just quickly wanted to come back in on the idea of community, and I think Ian's absolutely right. I think it's so fundamental to a workplace where people want to stay and be productive. But a lot of the times when we were talking about this, it feels like there is purely a kind of a business responsibility to create all of this stuff. But I think we need to also recognize that there is a personal responsibility towards creating community too, because it's the guy that you say hello to in the car parking place, who runs the car parking place in the morning, or the person who cleans the lifts, or the whatever. That personal responsibility, that where I want to not only be felt where I'm important, but I also want to make other people feel important, and that comes at an individual level, doesn't it, rather than an organizational level.
Yeah, very, very valid point.
Simon, at the risk of hijacking your session here,
You go for it.
I think that, as Chris talks about that, where this becomes very difficult for more remote and frontline workers, and you've actually seen a lot of companies after COVID pull their corporate staffs back in, because they recognized and appreciated how difficult it was to create a culture. And so while it's the responsibility without question of the organization to support folks and for the employees to engage in that, the point that really the intersection of that is ensuring that employees have the tools that they need to be able to do that. It's very hard to create community when I'm someplace where I don't see my peers all the time. Certainly with my customers, my clients, my patients, I can do that. And so creating tools, and you know, we're on with Blink, and so the Blink tool is one of the things that can be provided that really helps support and create engagement, and makes it easy for people to actually be part of a community where it's historically been very difficult.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think I completely agree on this dual responsibility of the employee and the employer. I do think where the employer has an additional responsibility is that show of intent and willingness. And that can be providing the tools, it can be talking about it, it can be having it on the right agendas. But if you want an employee to take control of having that conversation, they need to know that it's going to be well received in the internal culture. So completely agree. And tooling, absolutely critical part of that. Let's move on to our second question, because I know we could talk all day on these really important subjects. But what impact does a stressed frontline have on an organization? I'm going to come to you first on this, Ian, because I know you lived this for a very long time. Talk us through your experience on this.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, because we're talking about businesses and corporations, it's easy to just go straight to a financial place. And when you look at the financial impact that frontline employee stress has on your organization, the first thing is turnover. You have tremendous turnover, and we see in the frontline industries with frontline workers that turnover is often the single greatest problem that they have, staffing appropriately for the demand that's in the marketplace. And the cost of that is skyrocketing every day. You know, as we've seen people leave the workforce, change industries, and staff, HR staff having to grow significantly to be able to, what I like to call is fill the leaky bucket. Just keep hiring people to try and stay ahead of the turnover. A piece that people don't think as much about is the missed revenue. There's a significant amount of revenue that's missed because you don't have the staff to capitalize on that. And that is often as high and sometimes higher than the costs you have of just having to churn through employees and turnover. There's also a market reputation piece, and I'll put in with that your partners, you know, whether you have vendors, strategic partners in the industry, where you become less reliable because you can't bring resources to bear to help them solve their problems, and that's what you're in business to do. And I think, you know, that really becomes an issue. From a cost perspective, just to give people an idea, I was working with a home health agency that had to hire about 500 people every month. And just looking at the cost of hiring, training, onboarding, not being able to fill revenue, the estimated expenses are in excess of $35 million annually. So, you know, just being able to impact that by 1, 2, 3, 5% can have a material impact on the company's financial performance.
Fantastic, thank you, Ian. Some really great, some great facts and figures there to really show us that story come to life. And Chris, I know you touched on in your opening answer about this concept of presenteeism, and I think it's probably relevant here as well. Do you want to talk us through that a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so presenteeism and absenteeism, many people will have heard both, but for me to kind of better understand it, absenteeism is people off work sick getting better. Presenteeism is people at work sick getting sicker. We know about presenteeism in kind of physical illnesses. We don't want people coming into the office with flu. Why? Because they're going to pass it on to everybody else, and that's a kind of high risk. But it's maybe a little more difficult to understand how damaging presenteeism is, because if people are at work, they can't, you know, they've got to be all right, right? But the cost to UK business every year for mental health, Deloitte have done a kind of 5-7 year study into this stuff, and they said 45 billion pounds a year cost of mental health to UK business. Only 7 billion of that is made up of absenteeism, which you would have thought would have been the larger kind of costs, where in fact presenteeism is at 27 billion pounds. It's almost 3-4 times the amount that absenteeism costs. So if that's happening, what is it that presenteeism does that's so incredibly damaging? Well, it's the unseen stuff where you've got people in the office working 10 hours a day being productive for 3. It's poorer customer relations, it's mistakes being made, it's negativity in the office. It's people in the end going off long-term sick because they've hit burnout, or they're going off long-term sick with depression or similar illness. So this is a kind of insidious cost that we don't properly understand enough, I don't think. And we certainly don't know how to unpick it and see it and understand it at the beginning and catch it. Because very often the trouble is people coming into work stressed, it's very often it's not just about the workplace situation. Yes, that can be part of it, but somebody walks in through the door with their whole self, their whole family, their whole financial, all of that stuff going on behind them. And we need to be able to kind of look at both. But presenteeism is something that we really need to get better at uncovering sooner. And that's about people being trained, understood, skilled enough to have a conversation with people. A lot of what the mental health first aid movement's about, really.
Yeah. Chris, this is a super interesting topic, but if we think about presenteeism, particularly through the angle of a frontline organization, how does that idea of a dispersed workforce either increase or decrease or not change the possibility of presenteeism?
Interestingly, they've just looked at some studies for the prevalence of presenteeism, whether at home or hybrid, or whether within the office, and they're almost exactly the same. There are risks, of course, for being at home. There are, but there's also protective measures. You know, I work from home. I can go and pay the council tax, get a prescription, do this, that, or the other, come back, and have all of those freedoms. There are certain freedoms and benefits that come from home working. There are obviously negatives as well, but presenteeism pretty much on a par within the office or hybrid at home.
Wow, that's really interesting, because I think we've probably historically thought of presenteeism as an in-office phenomenon, right? Probably something we associated with physically spending time in a space. But I think it's really important to see that these behaviors and these ways of working can exist no matter where you are. And particularly as we're talking about frontline workers today, that's incredibly prevalent.
Simon?
Yeah, go ahead.
If I could, there's the things that Chris talks about, which, can be very clinical sometimes in nature, right? And important things that we all think about. I think we need to add 2 more disease states to our kind of clinical thinking. And they're the 2, in my opinion, most dangerous comorbidities that exist in the workforce. And that would be employee disengagement and employee dissatisfaction. And I think if we acknowledge and treat them like, ailments, we can really start to really diagnose that more effectively and then treat that. And then as we get better, really prevent that, as best we can. And if you think about that concept of presenteeism, including things like dissatisfaction and disengagement from the organization, studies show that in your total population, it's almost a third of people who are actively engaged, actively disengaged. And then that middle piece, which is really the kind of presenteeism, which are passively disengaged, which means at any point in time, as much as 2/3 of your workforce is not fully engaged in providing, the work and the support and treating your customers the way that they need to be treated.
Yeah, very relevant, Ian, really. And it brings us on to sort of our next question, because one of the things that can allow that culture to fester and even grow and evolve is when people don't feel like they've got the ability to talk about this stuff at work, or they don't feel they've got the ability to be speaking to their managers. So the next question that we received was, how do you create a culture where it's okay to say I'm not okay, especially with deskless teams? Chris, I'm going to come first to you on this one, because I know this is very prevalent to the work that you do. What do you think it is about creating that culture that makes people comfortable to start this important discussion?
Chris, I think you're on mute.
I do apologize. There's always a tech issue, isn't there? Yeah. So how do you? And I think it's important to understand that we need to skill two sets of people here. If we're talking about frontline managers and frontline workers, you need managers who are comfortable enough. I mean, in our training, we have people on day one going, you know, I did my physical first aid and I can kind of do chest compressions and that's all right. But I'm not, you know, there's no way that I'm sitting down talking to somebody about depression. Whereas that's not the case. What we're skilling people to do is to have honest conversations. And the trouble is those exactly that set of people that Ian was talking about, those people who are kind of half disengaged, or, you know, that we want to get to before they're fully disengaged, because it's very difficult to backtrack on that. It's about having honest and open conversations, and particularly for me, it's in one-to-ones when line managers are working with people. And to me, yeah, okay, there is the kind of fixed one-to-one where you're spending 75% of the time or 90% of the time at the moment talking about KPIs and the rest of it, whereas actually what we want people to do is to spend a lot more of that time talking about what's going really on for that person. And we're not, this isn't about anybody being a counselor. It's, for me, it's about somebody being a decent human being. And that's my kind of bottom line on this stuff is be a decent human being to somebody. If you pick up that something's not right, find the time. You know, if people feel undervalued and the rest of it, you know, the managers that I had in my youth who I really remember were the guys who went out their way to find time, spend time with me, nourish me, you know, educate me, feed me. And that is a big part of what we're doing. But having that culture created from on high, and again, going back to Yo Sushi, that's what made that so easy, was because the board turned around and went, we're doing this stuff. And it was communicated and there was a willingness to do it. And it happened from the top down. And because of that, it became something where it became a lot easier for people to go, I just can't do this shift. I'm just so anxious. And yeah, okay, you've got somebody, but at least you've got honesty and you're able to deal with it rather than losing somebody completely. So creating this space where people can do that is, you know, it's not just the decent human being thing, but the payoffs for it are enormous as well. You know, recruitment, retention, you know, enormous. So we must do it. We must do it from a business point of view, but fundamentally we must do it because we must not allow people to get broken within the system.
Yeah, definitely agree with all of that, Chris. I think that's really important. You mentioned the top down thing, and maybe it's a Yo Sushi example or maybe another one, but that would assume that the manager is starting the conversation. Have you got any tips or any experience with how we create a culture where the employee feels comfortable and safe to start the conversation?
Almost that it's the other way around, that they're aware that managers have this conversation. You know, I would always say to frontline managers is that you don't need to, for me, you don't need to be standing back and pretending you're all well. If somebody's talking to me about anxiety, I would much rather I have somebody turn around and going, do you know what? I don't get that stuff, but geez, I know what anxiety is like for me before a presentation or whatever. So you've got somebody being open and honest, because it's a two-way dialogue. So creating that culture works both ways, I think, from frontline manager and worker.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you, Chris. Ian, what about your thoughts on this one? I guess particularly with your hands-on experience, how have you seen this one create those sort of cultures?
I think the first thing you need to do is invert the hierarchy. We sit up in offices and office buildings, and our team, our employees, they work for us, and that's just wrong. I think if you start by making yourself vulnerable, putting yourself out there, demonstrating that you're truly that servant leader, that you work for them because they work for your customers, that starts to open things up. You spend time understanding what they do, what their plight is. You demonstrate by being present. And sometimes that's difficult because of remote workers or frontline folks, but you can do that through continual communications that are not chores, but they are actually a core part of your job. Do spend time with the folks. Once you break down that barrier by inverting the triangle and then the hierarchy, and you spend time with folks, there's no longer this fear factor of, the president is here or boss is here. It's just another person, and they truly trust you to have their back and support them. And when that occurs, and you're always acknowledged as the leader, so there's no risk to your ego, but you recognize that your job is to support them. I think that's really important. I know in my career, once I stood up in front of a large group of folks that were the frontline folks, and I said to them that, I used to think when I got to this level in an organization that I am so in control of my career and my success. And then I realized how wrong I was, that the higher I got in an organization, the less control I had of my career and my success, and that all of you have that control. And so my job is to make sure that I'm doing what you need me to do. And they thought I was crazy, but I shared with them that if you all walk into the CEO's office right now, and his name was Brad at the time, and tell Brad that if Ian comes to work tomorrow or not, guess who won't be at work tomorrow? When you create the environment that people understand that you understand their value, and that you're there to support them, they will feel much more comfortable sharing personal as well as work-related opportunities to improve the environment.
Absolutely agree, right? That role of the experience of feeling valued is critical. And I think one of the roles that plays a critical part in making people feel valued is that first line manager, right? So it's not always necessarily going to be the CEO or that executive person, but the frontline manager. So let's talk a bit about frontline managers or first line managers. What role do we think they play in supporting that well-being? I'll come back to you, Ian, because you've touched on this a little bit already. But also really importantly, how do we support frontline managers in giving that support, giving that mental health and well-being support to their teams?
I think that the first line managers are the most undervalued people in the organization, and they're the most oppressed. And I say it that way specifically because I think of them as the sandwich level in the organization. They're being pressured from the folks on the front line. And more likely than anything, they've come from the front line most recently, and they are committed to supporting the front line. But they're pressured from the top down to hit certain metrics and standards and do a lot of administrative things that eat up all their time that they want to spend supporting the front line. And so they find themselves conflicted. And as a result, they neglect themselves. And they have a difficult time being successful, working for their front line and the management at the same time. And so what's really, really critical is to give them tools and simplify the administrative part of their job so that they can spend the time with the front line, because it's really hard to get to all the front line, and that first line manager really makes that happen if you give them the tools, the time, and the support. And what's unfortunate is that we think about the frontline folks and we think about the corporate folks when we leave the first line managers out, and turnover occurs because they get stressed and they burn out and they don't feel valued and appreciated or have the tools. They don't have the autonomy to do their jobs. They leave, and that really amplifies the disengagement and dissatisfaction at the front line. And so you see greater turnover at that level also. If you think about it, we've also generally not done a great job of taking our best frontline people, turning them into first line managers without the necessary training and tools to effectively do that job.
Absolutely. And one of the trainings and tools we can give managers in this space, Chris, is some of the work that you do, right? You spend a lot of time training managers and training cultures. Anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's the vast majority of what I do is training frontline managers in whatever, whatever area it is. And almost to a T that they are scared, a little bit anxious, and a bit dubious, really, that this is going to give them any tools that they don't already have. And I totally agree with what Ian said about these guys being the sandwich kind of in the middle. And their teams are their absolute saviors. They're the people that kind of get everything done and allow them to kind of report back up and everything. But they're also the people. They're not saviors when they go off long-term sick and the rest of it. You know, they are then the angst that passes on up through the chain. So yeah, I think they are in a particular spot. So giving them the tools that allows them to talk to people on a level that is going to uncover, support, all of this. My biggest concern is that when people can't talk to other people about it, somebody said to me once, we're only as sick as our secrets, Chris. And I think that stuff that is sitting in people's head that is not uncovered, we find out that once we start to uncover it, in fact, just talking about it can take the power of that stuff away, that there can be a bit of hope and there can be a solution there. But training people that we're not teaching people to be counselors. You don't need that. What you do need is that decent human being stuff and some guidance to be able to spot it, talk about it, guide to the appropriate professional help. It's not rocket science.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said earlier, because I think you used the word comfortable earlier, managers being comfortable with the conversation. The other word I often use in this context is confident enough to have that conversation as well.
Yeah.
But I think often managers actually want to have it. They might even have the skills to have it very well, but it's often that confidence level to go, hey, I don't feel qualified. I don't feel like I can help. Whereas I think, Ian, you were saying earlier, right? Just people knowing that we're all in the same boat sometimes can just build that confidence and rapport. So we're going to move on to the final question that we received beforehand, and we're going to continue on this trend of managers because I think it's really important. And we're going to talk about what strategies are successful when it comes to promoting and protecting the frontline well-being. But I want to jump in. There's been a really interesting comment actually made by Brooke Graham. Hi, Brooke. Thank you so much for your comment. That was really interesting. And you talked about, as managers, this context of, hey, we want to have the conversation, but we've got so much on. Right, we've got so many different priorities, and it's hard to make this the top priority or hard to get it to the top of the agenda. How do you do that? I can absolutely empathize with having lived this in my career. In my career, it's so easy to go into one-to-one meetings and get incredibly tactical, right? Get down to the day-to-day and the busyness. I think there's two things for me that have really unlocked prioritizing this. The first one is make it the first thing on the agenda, not the last thing on the agenda. Because if you're a talker like me, you never get to the last thing on the agenda, right? So make it the first thing. It also shows your employee how much you're prioritizing it, and it often changes the context of that one-to-one session. So starting off by asking, hey, how are you doing? right? How are you feeling this week? How are things going? Have you had a good week? Those broad questions that can really instigate a conversation. By starting the one-to-one with them, it shows a different level of prioritization, but it also helps the employee really, really open up at the start of the conversation, which can then help the rest. And then I think the second thing, and I think Ian put a really good stamp on this earlier, but it's also getting to this point of, as leaders, not necessarily seeing our employees' well-being and their impact in the business as separate things and as parallel tracks that never meet, right? Ian threw out some fantastic stats earlier, right, about the impact that is had when we don't get this right or when our employees aren't firing. Chris spoke about presenteeism and the effect that that has. Actually, talking about how your employees doing, how they're managing their workload, how they're managing their prioritization and staying on top of what they're doing, that contributes to high workload. It contributes to efficiency, and it contributes to that commercial element or tactical element of the one-to-ones that you're having. So absolutely not the expert, Brooke, by any stretch of the imagination, but I've definitely been where you're feeling right now. And those are two tips that I've specifically used to really promote and protect frontline well-being. Let's come to Chris. Chris, for you, do you have any strategies that you want to share with the listeners?
I actually just wanted to pick up on what Brooke was asking as well, because I think it's so valid and it's such a common thing. And I don't think it always has to be a massive event. Yes, I would always want to talk about it in one-to-one, but I would say it's even more effective in a kind of drip. You know, if I'm seeing somebody who's not good, I'm just going, are you all right? If I haven't got 5 minutes to look after that person, you know, if I don't understand exactly, as Ian said, that you know, these things are completely aligned. If I don't deal with it, it's gonna cost. So those small conversations, just here and there, just picking up, just checking in, just understanding that somebody gives a damn, you know. So I don't think it always has to be a massive event. So yeah. So for me, it's back to the strategies within. For me, the most important thing is finding routes for that inverted triangle that Ian was talking about to be able to feed up. Now, yes, customer surveys, employee surveys are really useful and you get some really useful information, but creating a forum, a place where people can be open and honest, whether that's within the team, whether that's within the wider business, but allowing people to be heard, because when people aren't heard, I think that's when it's incredibly damaging. So, and that can be challenging. That can be challenging, creating those, listening to those, because if you're creating it and not listening to the answers, then it's a pointless exercise. So you do have to be kind of quite brave about it. But that's, for me, is the most important thing is voices from the bottom up.
Thanks, Chris. And Ian, any strategies that you found to be successful?
Yeah, I'd like to at least start by answering Brooke's question, at least from my perspective a little bit, and then talk about some strategies. And to Brooke and everyone else, you know, if you think about this as a mathematical equation, you're trying to deliver efficiencies and high work performance, and that's the right side of the equal sign. The left side of the equal sign are the things, are your employees, right? And their ability to engage and perform. And you can't you can't do anything to the right side of the equal sign. It just happens. It's a function of what's on the left. And so if you spend the time really focusing on your employees and helping them be engaged and satisfied in addressing their health concerns, especially when it's work-related stress, that will naturally improve the right side, which are the outcome measures that your bosses, the management, tends to hold you accountable for. So it is absolutely one of these things where you acknowledge and recognize that if I get the employee side right, my metrics will come out where they need to be. And no matter how hard I try, if I get the employee side wrong, you're not going to get the outcomes. I've recently taken up swimming again, and what I've learned about swimming is that the harder you try with bad form, the tireder you get and the slower you get. And to me, that's the same thing. Figure out the right form and the right approach to treating your employees, engaging them, helping them, and you'll get the outcomes you need. When I look at specifically ways and strategies for doing that, communication is the single most impactful strategy. Effective, continual communication, where it's not an event, it's just communication, and it happens continually. And people get comfortable with it, and they get trust builds. Folks see you as being open to it, following through. And I also see that putting yourself in a vulnerable position is very helpful. I was actually coaching someone this morning who's got some challenging employee situations. And my suggestion to him was, go to your employee asking about your problem and how they can help you. And you start to pull them into the process, and you feel exposed. They feel as though they're helping you, and they'll start to be open about their opportunities and challenges also. So those are a couple of things I've seen work.
Absolutely. And Ian and Chris, it's interesting because you both, Chris, I loved your thing about not everything has to be a big deal, right? You don't have to prepare for the conversation. And Ian, you're talking about communication. In my last year, one of the things I have found to be most impactful on this is actually the Blink product, right? The Blink product gives you such an ability to contact anyone at any point during their day. And actually, you're not having to get them at a point when they're free, because you can send the message and they might pick it up later. You can send it to a group of people. It can be as short as, how are you doing? It can be as long as, here's a list of my day and what I've done and why I've had a bad day. But that ability to offer what is real time for the individual, no matter if they're in a healthcare facility, if they're on the road, whatever they're doing. I think just finding those communication tools, and Blink being a fantastic one to do that, has definitely been beneficial to me as I've been trying to help my team with this as well. Cool. We're going to finish up with a final question. So we had a number of questions come in, so thank you for that. But I'm going to pick the one from Brooke Graham. So thank you, Brooke, for your question. Really, really appreciate it. And Brooke's question says, sorry, not Brooke Graham, Penny Ashworth, apologies, wrong name. How do you balance the risk of understanding someone who's anxious or doesn't want to do work with the risk of losing the workers who are covering them? So this idea of, how do you balance up the amount of attention you pay to the employees who maybe need the support or maybe struggling with their well-being, but also the fact that the more time you spend on that could have a negative impact on the rest of the team's well-being? Chris and Ian, not sure who wants to jump in on this one, but it's an interesting quandary for many managers, I'm sure.
I think that diagnosing up front, first of all, is as a manager, have I provided that specific individual with the tools and the training that they need to do their job, right? Are there clear expectations? And if I haven't done that, then their performance is on me. If I have provided all, it's then, do I have them in the right position, starting to look at those types of things. And then there's a point where, are there some outside influences impacting that person, trying to understand what that is. And obviously you need to keep confidentiality of that person's, personal life, anything that they share with you. If you've built an environment of trust with your employees, all of them, then they trust that you're doing the right thing. And that comes from, do you take the right actions when they need to be taken for people who are not performing because they choose not to perform, or because they choose not to come to work and the burden falls on everyone else. So I do think, again, being able to now acknowledge people's performance, the ones who are doing a great job, and show that you value them, you need to take the time to do that. In terms of a performance issue, you have to, once you understand what the cause is, you need to take swift action with employees who are not performing, and it's really on them. It's within their control. And then people will trust that you're doing more of the right thing with the other employees, and they'll understand that much more effectively. But you do also need to demonstrate appreciation for those folks who are filling in.
Yep.
And that it's not always compensation, but sometimes it is. It's sometimes an extra day off. It's sometimes just a public acknowledgement of, the extra effort that they're putting in.
Yeah, totally. Just a question I had from a store manager one day when I was training, and he was saying, I'm getting sick to the back teeth of stress and anxiety as being the reason for people being off sick. He said it's the new diarrhea and vomiting to get a few days off. He said, what do you expect me to do with those people? I said, I expect you to treat everybody who says that they've got stress and anxiety as if they've got stress and anxiety. And the ones that have will end up being really loyal members of staff, will hang around and they'll look after you. And the other ones will go by the wayside naturally anyway. They will just fall away from it. They will not be performing as they should. And plenty of people with serious mental health conditions thrive and have, very successful careers. It isn't a kind of burden to people being successful and moving forward.
Absolutely. And I think I just piggyback on one of the things Ian said, because I think this is really pertinent. Making sure that you're acknowledging the extra work that somebody does is really important. I think sometimes managers have a tendency to think, hey, and I'll let them know that I know that person isn't pulling their weight, or I'll talk to them about that person. That doesn't build trust in an organization. Because when a manager does that to the team, actually the person's sitting thinking, wow, what do they say about me? Right? When are they going to break my confidentiality, or what are they going to say about me in that next one-to-one? So absolutely love for both Ian and Chris landed on that. If someone's going above and beyond, regardless of why they're having to go above and beyond, we absolutely call that out. We find the right way to do that, to acknowledge that. And then to Ian and Chris's point as well. And then we deal with the other situation, but be very careful about blending the two, because I've seen managers use that to very negative consequences. And actually one of the biggest words we've heard today is trust. And the way you build a culture of trust is, treating people how they expect to be treated, and how they want you to treat them in future as well. So thank you, Ian. Thank you, Chris. Good conversation. We knew we'd run over. We said in our pre-meet, didn't we? We're talkers. So we knew the three of us would run over, but absolutely great conversation today. I hope it's been useful for those of you on the call. I'm going to hand back to Hannah from Blink just to take us home.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you very much to Chris and Ian as well for a really interesting, really insightful discussion today on a very important topic. So before we sign off, just a quick note to let you know that what you've been listening to today is the Shift Live. And if you're not already receiving the Shift in your inboxes, there is a link to sign up over there. You'll be getting a copy every 2 weeks in your inbox, and it is news, insights, and opinions specifically for leaders in frontline organizations just like yourselves. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us all today. Recording will be in your inboxes tomorrow, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.